For those of you who have been with us for a while, you know that family can be the greatest source of love, and sometimes the deepest pain. Today, on Family Revenge Secrets, we're not just talking about betrayal, we're talking about the silent moments that lead up to it. It's in those quiet decisions, those simple acts of kindness, that a story of resentment begins. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single chapter of stories like this. Today's story is called My Daughter-in-Law Thinks I'm a Bank. Deborah Hayes had always believed that a mother's job was never truly finished. It didn't end when her son, Liam, graduated college with honors. It didn't end when he met Ashley, a beautiful young woman who filled his eyes with a kind of light Deborah hadn't seen since he was a boy. It certainly didn't end when he called to say they were engaged, and it absolutely didn't end when she retired from her job as a high school librarian, a job she'd held for 3 decades. For Deborah, retirement wasn't a time to stop giving. It was an opportunity to give more. She was 58, and the world had been good to her. The tidy little house in the suburbs that she and her late husband had bought so many years ago was now a testament to a life well lived. Its walls held the echoes of laughter, the scent of fresh-baked cookies, and the quiet dignity of a mother raising her son. But those walls, she decided, were too quiet now. They were too big for just one person, and more importantly, they were too far away from Liam and Ashley, who were living in a small, cramped apartment in the city. One afternoon, sitting at her kitchen table and tracing the patterns on her old ceramic mug, the idea came to her. It was a grand idea, a final act of devotion. She would sell the house. It was worth a substantial amount now, a nest egg she had always planned to use for her later years. But what good were later years if they were spent alone, separated from the very people she had worked so hard for? She called Liam, her voice a little shaky with excitement. "I have a proposition for you and Ashley," she said, her heart fluttering like a bird. "What would you say to a new home? One with a yard for the dogs, a guest room for friends, a place where you can truly grow?" Liam's reaction was exactly what she had hoped for. A gasp, then a stammering torrent of "Mom, what are you talking about?" And "We can't afford that." Deborah smiled. "You don't have to afford it," she said gently. "It's from me, my gift to you both." She used the majority of the money from the sale of her house, far more than she had ever intended, to purchase a beautiful, spacious home in a quiet, affluent neighborhood. It was the kind of house she had only ever seen in magazines. It had high ceilings, sprawling windows, and a generous backyard. Best of all, it had a small, private guest cottage tucked away behind the main house, a perfect little space for her. It was the kind of arrangement that seemed like a perfect family story, the kind you read about in heartwarming books. She was close enough to be there for them, but far enough away to give them space. A perfect balance, or so she thought. When they closed on the house, Ashley hugged her so tightly that Deborah felt her ribs protest. "Oh, Deb, thank you, thank you." Ashley cried, her eyes shining with what Deborah mistook for pure gratitude. "This is a dream come true. You've given us our future." It felt good. It felt right. The act of giving had always been a source of purpose for Deborah. She had given her time, her energy, her love. Now she was giving her life savings. It was a tangible form of her love, a concrete monument to a mother's sacrifice. She moved into her small, one-bedroom cottage, and though it was a fraction of the size of her old home, it felt like a haven. She could see the sprawling main house from her window, a symbol of the beautiful future she had helped build for her children. The first few weeks were wonderful. She'd have coffee with Ashley in the mornings, and Liam would come over in the evenings to help her with small chores. But one afternoon, as they sat on the bare living room floor of the main house, Ashley's gratitude began to shift. "The place is beautiful, Deb, truly," Ashley said, pulling at a loose thread on the carpet, "but it feels so empty." Deborah nodded. "We'll get it furnished, slowly, one piece at a time." Ashley let out a soft, almost imperceptible sigh. "Oh, I was hoping to have a housewarming party soon, but with no furniture, it just doesn't feel right." She paused, a practiced look of innocent contemplation on her face. I saw the most beautiful sectional at that place on Elm Street, and it was on sale, just for a few days." Deborah's heart gave a little jolt. It wasn't a request, not exactly, but it was a clear signal. It would make the house feel so much more like a home. Ashley continued, her voice soft and persuasive. "Just a little bit of help, Deb, just for the furniture. I'm sure you have a small amount left over from the sale." And in that moment, Deborah didn't hesitate. She didn't stop to think about her own retirement fund, her own future, or the careful financial planning she had done for decades. She simply saw the hope in Ashley's eyes, heard the subtle plea in her voice, and remembered the promise she had made to herself, to give all she had. "Of course, dear," Deborah said, the words coming easily to her lips. "Tell me how much you need. It's the least I can do." It felt like a small and simple kindness, a gesture of love, but in a way she could not yet comprehend, it was the first stone in the foundation of the golden cage she was building for herself. A cage woven with threads of sacrifice, generosity, and the silent, unspoken expectation that a mother's kindness was a limitless resource. This small act of giving, she would one day learn, was not the end of a long journey, but the very beginning of a long and painful one. A month after the sectional, a new request arrived. This time, it was a kitchen appliance. Not a refrigerator or a stove, but a high-end espresso machine, one of those sleek, stainless steel contraptions that looked more like a spaceship than a coffee maker. Ashley had found it on a limited-time offer, a phrase that Deborah was beginning to realize was Ashley's polite way of saying, "Act now, pay later." "We just want to be able to host our friends properly, Deb," Ashley said with a disarming smile. "People our age, they expect a decent cappuccino after dinner. It's a part of the whole experience." Deborah looked at Liam, expecting a word, a gesture, anything to say, "Mom, it's okay, we'll wait." But Liam was busy scrolling on his phone, his face a mask of practiced neutrality. It was an absence of reaction that spoke louder than any words. It was a silence that Deborah had never heard before from her son, a silence that gave Ashley all the space she needed. And so, the espresso machine arrived. Then came the requests for a custom-built entertainment center, a brand-new lawn mower for the huge yard she'd gifted them, and a series of small loans for what Ashley called lifestyle adjustments. These adjustments included designer handbags, jewelry for a charity gala she was attending, and tickets to a tropical resort that were a steal. The conversations were always the same, a meticulously choreographed dance of manipulation. Ashley would come to Deborah with a carefully curated story. She would tell her about an unfair situation at work, or the pressure from her friends, or a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. She'd always end her plea with a phrase designed to hit Deborah's emotional core. "I know you want us to be happy, Deb," she'd say, her eyes wide and innocent. "I know you want us to have the life you sacrificed so much for." The words were so sharp, so precise, they felt like daggers. "You don't want us to have a good life. You're not doing this because you love us. You're holding back." They weren't spoken out loud, but they were there, hanging in the air like an unspoken threat. Deborah found herself justifying each purchase, not to anyone else, but to the ghosts of her own intentions. This wasn't about spoiling them. This was about ensuring their happiness. This was what a good mother did. She watched her life savings, once a sturdy dam against the uncertainty of the future, begin to drain away into a bottomless pit. She had seen pits like this before in the books she'd loved, stories of endless quests, of heroes searching for a thing that could never be found. But this wasn't a hero's journey. This was the quiet, slow surrender of a life's worth of security. Liam, her sweet, gentle son, remained on the sidelines, an observer in his own life. When Deborah tried to talk to him about it, he would shrug and say, "Mom, it's just stuff. It makes Ashley happy." Just stuff. Deborah wanted to scream the words back at him. Was the money she'd worked for 30 years for just stuff? Was her financial independence just stuff? Was the peace of mind she was giving up just stuff? But she didn't scream. Instead, she'd nod and smile, and in her silence, she'd write another check. The truth was, the more she gave, the less grateful Ashley seemed to be. Gratitude had become a transactional commodity, traded for the next request. The heartfelt hugs had become quicker, the thank yous shorter. The money was simply expected, like a monthly utility bill. Deborah was no longer the loving mother-in-law. She was a resource. She was the family's personal bank, and the balance was shrinking fast. The golden cage she had so lovingly built was starting to feel less like a haven and more like a prison. The news arrived like a burst of sunlight on a cloudy day. "We're pregnant, Deb." Liam's voice, a mixture of pride and nerves, had never sounded so bright. Ashley's laughter echoed in the background. Deborah dropped the dish towel she was holding and felt a wave of pure, unadulterated joy wash over her. A grandchild, a piece of her son, a continuation of their family's story. This was it. This was the purpose she had been seeking. All the money, all the sacrifices, all the endless checks, it was all worth it for this. For a new life to love, a new soul to guide. For a few weeks, the golden cage felt less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. Deborah spent her days poring over baby books and knitting tiny blankets. She didn't mind the stream of requests for expensive baby gear, the organic, hand-stitched nursery bedding, the state-of-the-art baby monitor. This was different. This was for the baby. This was for a grandchild she already adored. But the requests, as they always did, began to change in nature. "A car seat and a stroller are pretty much all we need, right?" Deborah asked one afternoon, trying to sound casual as she looked through a catalog. Ashley gave a tight, humorless laugh. "A car seat, Deb, that's so basic. We're getting the Silver Cross Balmoral, of course. It's what all the new moms in the neighborhood have. It's a legacy piece." The price of the stroller was more than Deborah's entire monthly social security check. She took a deep breath. "Ashley, honey, that's a lot of money. I'm not sure." Ashley's smile disappeared. Her expression hardened into something cold and unfamiliar. "Not sure. Deb, this isn't for us. It's for the baby. You want your grandchild to be safe, don't you? You don't want them to ride around in some cheap, unsafe stroller." The guilt was a hot spike in Deborah's chest. Of course she wanted her grandchild to be safe, but safety wasn't measured in dollars, was it? A few weeks later, the topic turned from strollers to something far larger. "We'll need to trade in the sedan," Liam said, his gaze fixed on a car ad on his phone. "The sedan is perfectly fine," Deborah said, feeling a familiar knot of dread in her stomach. "It has a great safety rating." "It's not an SUV, though," Ashley cut in, her tone sharp. "Everyone knows an SUV is safer with a baby. Plus, we won't have enough space for all the baby stuff with that little car. We're looking at a brand new Escalade. It's the most responsible choice for our family." It was then that Deborah finally put her foot down. She had been financially drained, emotionally manipulated, but this was a step too far. "No," she said, her voice firm. "I'm sorry, but that's an irresponsible purchase and I cannot fund it." The silence that followed was deafening. Ashley's face went from a smile to a mask of indignation. Her eyes, usually so calculating, now seemed to hold a genuine, venomous anger. "Fine," Ashley said, her voice low and dangerous. "You don't want to help us give our baby the best start in life? Fine." She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Just remember this when our baby is born. We can't have someone in their life who isn't fully committed to their happiness and safety. And you know, it's a long drive from that little cottage of yours, isn't it?" The words hit Deborah like a physical blow. She wasn't just being asked for money anymore. She was being blackmailed. Her grandchild, the innocent life she had been so happy about, was being used as leverage. The love she felt was being weaponized against her. In that moment, the golden cage didn't just feel like a prison, it felt like a trap, with her heart and her legacy at stake. The price of a grandchild, she now understood, was far more than she could ever afford to pay. The words lingered in the quiet air between them, a cold, calculated strike. We can't have someone in their life who isn't fully committed to their happiness and safety. Ashley's threat wasn't a passing comment, it was a carefully aimed arrow, shot straight at Deborah's heart. It was a line drawn in the sand with the precious, innocent life of her grandchild. Deborah didn't respond. She simply turned and walked back to her cottage, the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. She fumbled with the key, her hands trembling. Inside, she sank onto her small sofa, the floral pattern of the cushions a blur as hot tears finally came. They weren't tears of sadness, not exactly. They were tears of clarity. For too long, she had viewed her generosity as a virtue. She had told herself she was being a good mother, a kind mother-in-law, a selfless woman. But in the bitter quiet of her little home, the truth emerged, stark and unforgiving. She had allowed herself to become a doormat. Her kindness had been mistaken for weakness, and her love had been treated as a limitless resource. The grand, noble gesture of giving them the house had turned into a slow, humiliating erosion of her dignity. She had traded her entire life's work for a golden cage, and now they were threatening to hold the one thing she truly cared about, her grandchild, just outside the bars. This is not love, she thought, the words echoing in the silence. This is not sacrifice. This is a game, and I have lost every round. The thought was a jolt of electricity, a spark of anger that ignited something in her that had been dormant for too long. For the first time, the pain wasn't just a dull ache, it was a fire. She felt a burning need to reclaim herself, to stand up and say, no more. She reached for her phone, her fingers hovering over the contacts. She couldn't call Liam, her son. Once her closest confidant, had become a stranger, a silent partner in her exploitation. She scrolled past his name and found one she hadn't dialed in years, Patricia, her best friend from college, a woman who had always been a rock of common sense and fierce loyalty. Deb, my goodness, it's been ages. Patricia's voice was like a warm blanket. Deborah's voice broke as she recounted the past year, the house, the endless requests, the final, brutal threat. There were long moments of silence on the other end, and Deborah could picture her friend's face, etched with shock and disbelief. Deb, you have to fight back, Patricia said, her voice firm. You have to, not just for your money, but for yourself. For the woman you used to be, you can't let them do this to you. The conversation was the catalyst. It was the moment the problem became a conflict. Following Patricia's advice, Deborah went to her desk and pulled out a stack of manila folders. She hadn't looked at them since she'd moved in. There were bank statements, wire transfer receipts, copies of old loan agreements, a meticulous financial history of her adult life. She began to sort through them, her fingers tracing the numbers on the pages. Each check, each transfer was not just a sum of money, it was a moment of hope, a moment of justification, a moment of quiet surrender. Here was the check for the sectional. Here was the wire transfer for the expensive handbag. Here, scribbled on a notepad, were the dates and times of Ashley's demands, each one now re-examined with a new, cold clarity. As she worked, the anger faded, replaced by a quiet, steely resolve. The numbers on the page began to tell a story, not of a generous mother, but of a woman being systematically drained of her life's work. She was building her case, not just for a lawyer, but for herself. She was creating a paper trail of the truth. Hours passed. The sun set and rose again, but Deborah kept going, fueled by a purpose she hadn't felt in a long, long time. By the time she was done, the stack of organized papers sat like a monument on her desk. It was no longer a collection of bills and statements. It was the evidence of her own awakening. The cage was still there, but now she held the key. The first step was complete. The next would be to find a lawyer and show them just what a bank was capable of doing when it finally decided to close its doors. The name on the door was etched in a simple, elegant font, Sarah Jenkins-esque. It was a name Deborah had found in an online directory, a name that came with a specialization in family disputes, a cold and clinical term for the heartache she was carrying. Deborah took a deep breath and pushed the heavy glass door open, the bell above it tinkling a nervous little melody. The office was not what she expected. There were no towering stacks of files or stern, mahogany desks. Instead, the room was bright, filled with natural light and the scent of fresh brewed coffee. Sarah Jenkins was a woman with kind eyes and a firm handshake. She didn't look like a lawyer, she looked like a person who listened. "Thank you for seeing me, Ms. Jenkins," Deborah began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please call me Sarah," the lawyer said, gesturing toward a comfortable armchair. "And thank you for coming in. Now, what can I help you with?" Deborah laid the manila folder on the small coffee table between them. It felt impossibly heavy, a ledger of her own foolishness. She began to speak, the words tumbling out in a rush, a year's worth of resentment, confusion, and fear finally given voice. She told Sarah about the house, the constant demands, the silent complicity of her son, and finally, the heartbreaking threat involving her grandchild. As she spoke, she braced herself for a look of pity or judgment, the kind she had seen in her own reflection. But Sarah's face remained impassive, a mix of professionalism and quiet empathy. She didn't interrupt. She simply listened, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. When Deborah finished, the silence was not a void but a space for thought. "Deborah," Sarah said at last, her voice calm and clear. "First, I want you to know that what you have described is financial abuse. It's not your fault, and you are not being unreasonable. You have every right to protect your assets and your well-being." The words were a bomb. For so long, Deborah had felt like a failure, a mother who had loved too much. Sarah's simple, honest statement was the validation she desperately needed. It was as if someone had finally opened a window in a stuffy room, letting in a gust of fresh air. Sarah picked up the folder. "These documents are very helpful," she said, her fingers moving over the bank statements. "They tell a very clear story. Based on what you've told me and the evidence you've provided, you have a strong legal basis to act. The money you put into the house can be seen as a gift, but the ongoing demands and the documented threats could be considered extortion. We can take steps to protect you." Deborah felt a glimmer of hope. What do we do?" "We have a few options," Sarah explained. "The first and most common is to send a formal legal letter. It's a very strong message. It basically says, we know what's happening, we're not a bank, and this needs to stop. Immediately. It outlines your rights and what will happen if they don't comply." She watched Deborah's face, sensing her apprehension. "It's not a lawsuit yet, Deborah. It's a formal warning. It's a way of drawing a line in the sand without escalating to a court battle, at least not yet. It forces them to take you seriously, to understand that you are no longer a passive source of funds." Deborah considered the words. A legal letter. The thought of it was terrifying, but the thought of living another day under Ashley's manipulation was even worse. The fear of confrontation was still there, but it was now overshadowed by a newfound sense of purpose. This wasn't just about money. It was about reclaiming her life, her dignity, her peace of mind. "And if they don't respond?" Deborah asked, her voice stronger now. "Then we discuss the next steps," Sarah said, her expression serious. "But let's start with the letter. It's the most powerful first move. It shows them you're no longer playing their game by their rules." As Deborah left the office and stepped back out into the bright afternoon sun, she felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in months. The heavy weight in her chest was gone, replaced by a quiet strength. The fear of being a bad mother had been replaced by the resolve of a woman who was finally and definitively putting herself first. She had found a guide. She had found a way forward. The golden cage was still there, but now she knew a way to open the door. The legal letter arrived on a Tuesday. Deborah didn't see it happen, but she imagined it, a crisp white envelope delivered to the grand front door of the house she had bought. It was a formal, sterile document, devoid of emotion, yet it carried the weight of everything she had endured. It was the first volley in a war she never wanted to fight. For a week, there was silence. No frantic phone calls, no furious texts from Ashley. The silence was more unnerving than the arguments. It was the calm before the storm, and Deborah spent it in her cottage, preparing herself for what she knew was coming. It came on Saturday morning. Liam called her, his voice tight and formal. "Can you come over? We need to talk." When she walked into the main house, the atmosphere was thick with hostility. The expensive sectional she had paid for sat in the center of the room like a throne, and Ashley was perched on it, her arms crossed, her face a mask of cold fury. Liam stood beside her, his hands shoved in his pockets, his posture defensive. Deborah sat in an armchair across from them, clutching the manila folder with her records. The house was now a courtroom, and she was presenting her case. "Liam said you sent us a letter," Ashley began, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "A legal letter. From a lawyer? What is this, Deb? Are you seriously doing this? Are you trying to ruin our family?" Deborah looked at her son, seeking some hint of the boy she had raised, the one who would have recoiled from such a confrontation. But his eyes met hers and then quickly darted away. His silence was louder than Ashley's words. "I'm not trying to ruin our family, Ashley," Deborah said, her voice steady. "I'm trying to save myself. I've lost a lot of money, and I have to stop the bleeding." Ashley let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. "Lost money? You gave us that money, Deb. You told us you wanted to help. You said you wanted to see us happy. And now you're calling in lawyers because we bought a few things? You're being incredibly selfish." The word selfish hung in the air, a bitter irony. Deborah took a deep breath. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She simply opened her folder and slid a neat stack of papers across the coffee table. "This is a list of every financial transaction I have made for you both since I moved in," she said, her voice clinical and detached. "It includes the money for the furniture, the appliances, the trips, and the handbag. The total comes out to a little over $250,000, not including the value of this house." Ashley's eyes widened as she picked up the papers. Her jaw went slack for a moment, the bravado slipping from her face, replaced by a momentary flash of fear. But it was quickly replaced by rage. She threw the papers back onto the table. "This is insane. You kept a ledger? What kind of person does that? This proves nothing. You gave us these things. You wanted to. You said so yourself." "I did," Deborah admitted, her voice calm. "But a gift is a gift. A constant demand is an expectation, and a threat against my grandchild is blackmail." The word hung in the air, a direct accusation. Liam finally spoke, his voice weak and pleading. "Mom, come on, it wasn't blackmail. Ashley was just upset. We were upset. You're making this into something it's not." Deborah looked at her son, and her heart ached. "Liam, she told me if I didn't buy you a new car, I wouldn't be able to see my grandchild. What would you call that?" Liam couldn't meet her eyes. He just shook his head, looking down at the floor. "It's not fair, Mom. We're your family. We thought we could count on you." Ashley seized the opportunity, her voice rising to a fever pitch. "Yeah, we thought you loved us. I can't believe you would do this to us. You're a terrible person, a terrible mother. You have all this money and you'd rather keep it to yourself than help your own family. You've broken our hearts." The words were a brutal, final assault, but they were no longer a weapon that could hurt Deborah. They were the desperate, angry cries of two people who had just realized their personal bank was closing its doors. Deborah stood up, her posture straight, her hands no longer trembling. This wasn't a family anymore. This was a direct, head-on conflict. And for the first time in a very long time, Deborah was no longer afraid to fight. After Deborah walked out of that tense confrontation, she went back to her cottage. The walk took less than a minute, but it felt like a journey across a vast, barren desert. The house that had once felt so welcoming was now a fortress, its windows dark and uninviting. She could hear the muffled sound of voices inside, angry, agitated voices, and she knew their fury was directed at her. For the next few days, a silent war was waged. Deborah would make her morning coffee and look out the window, hoping for a glimpse of Liam or Ashley, a sign that the rift could be mended. There were none. The calls from her sons stopped. The polite, infrequent texts from Ashley ceased entirely. The silence was a new kind of pain, a living, breathing thing. The first direct strike came 3 days later. Deborah walked across the yard to the main house. The scent of jasmine was in the air, a cruel reminder of the peace that had once existed here. She knocked on the front door, expecting an argument or perhaps a strained reconciliation. Ashley opened the door, her face a mask of cold hostility. "I just wanted to see the baby," Deborah said, her voice soft and hopeful. Ashley's eyes were like chips of ice. "She's sleeping," she said, without moving from the doorway. "And besides, you made your choice. You told us we were on our own. Well, now you are too." The door closed with a soft thud that sounded to Deborah like a final verdict. The threat had not been a hollow one. It was a promise, and Ashley had kept it. The price of a grandchild, a debt Deborah had refused to pay, was now being collected. The emotional toll began to mount. The phone calls to her close friends felt more like confessions than conversations. She'd say, "I had a falling out with Liam and Ashley," and the air would go quiet on the other end. She could feel the judgment in the silence, the unspoken question. What could a mother do to her own children to warrant such a thing? The word selfish that Ashley had used seemed to have an echo that followed her everywhere. Then, the rumors started to appear online. Deborah, who was an occasional user of social media, was tagged in a series of posts from Ashley's account. The photos were of her and Liam in happier times, but the captions were venomous. "Some people will do anything for money, even turn their backs on their own family." Another post, a picture of the baby nursery, read, "So thankful for true family who helped us build this. It's a shame not everyone's love is unconditional." Deborah's heart sank as she read the comments below. "Disgusting. Greedy mother-in-law. Some people don't deserve children." The online slander soon leaked into the real world. A neighbor, a kind man who had always stopped to chat about his garden, now only gave her a curt nod and a look of vague pity. An old friend who used to have her over for dinner suddenly became too busy. Deborah felt as if she were a ghost, moving through her own life, invisible to everyone she used to know. The house that she had given to her family was a symbol of her generosity, but now it felt like a testament to her failure, a grand and beautiful stage for her public shaming. She could have given in. She could have written another check, apologized, and begged for a chance to be let back in. But every day she woke up and faced the cold, distant front of the main house. She felt a quiet strength settle in her bones. This was no longer just about the money. This was about proving to herself that she was not a doormat. This was about reclaiming her dignity from the public lie that Ashley had painted. The pain of isolation was immense, but it was a purer, more honest pain than the quiet humiliation she had endured for a year. The golden cage was being dismantled, brick by brick, and with each brick removed, Deborah was becoming more and more free. She was a woman alone, but she was not broken, and her resolve to fight was stronger than ever. The rumors swirled around Deborah like a bitter wind, but she no longer shivered. Each whispered comment, each knowing glance from a neighbor, was a testament to the lie Ashley had created. But Deborah had her own truth, a silent, stubborn thing that resided in the core of her being. The pain of being cut off from her son and grandchild was a fire, but it was also a forge. It hardened her resolve, turning her sorrow into steel. She was not fighting for an apology. She was fighting for her right to exist on her own terms. She called Sarah, her lawyer, and told her what had happened. There was no emotion in Deborah's voice, only a quiet certainty. "It's time to move forward," she said. A week later, Deborah sat across from Sarah again, but this time the conversation was purely business. Sarah laid a stack of legal documents on the table. They were clean, precise, and utterly without passion, a cold antidote to the emotional fire that had consumed Deborah's life for over a year. "This is a legal petition," Sarah explained, her tone measured. "It asks the court to enforce a financial agreement. It doesn't demand the money back as a gift, but it seeks to establish legal ownership of the property you purchased and a clear boundary to end all future financial demands. It's a way of saying the emotional game is over. This is the law now." Deborah read through the documents. They used words like plaintiff, defendant, and jurisdiction. They spoke of the monetary value of the house, the documented transactions, and the lack of a formal loan agreement. It was all a formal echo of the ledger she had so painstakingly created in her cottage. It was a story told in numbers and legal clauses, a language that could not be manipulated by tears or threats. Deborah signed the papers, her hand steady. It was the moment she stopped being the passive mother-in-law and became a plaintiff. It was the moment she drew a line in the sand, a line that could not be washed away by a sob story or a public smear campaign. The documents were officially served to Liam and Ashley by a process server a few days later. For a moment, Deborah imagined the scene, the stranger at their front door, the envelope with the courthouse seal. She imagined the look on Ashley's face as she opened it, expecting a bill or an advertisement, only to find court papers with Deborah's name on them. Initially, Liam and Ashley treated the lawsuit as they had the legal letter, a bluff. They ignored the phone calls from their own lawyer, convinced that their mother was too soft, too loving to ever truly take them to court. They didn't understand that the mother they thought they knew was gone. She had been replaced by a woman who had been pushed past her breaking point and was now fighting with a quiet, fierce resolve. But the reality of the situation soon began to sink in. The first court summons arrived. The letters from Sarah's office became more frequent and more demanding. The legal language was no longer something to be ignored. It was a looming threat. The phone rang in Deborah's cottage late one evening. It was Liam, his voice frantic and laced with a panic she had never heard before. "Mom, what are you doing? This is insane. We just got another letter from the court. You're really going to sue us? Is this some kind of sick joke?" Deborah's heart ached at the sound of his fear, but she didn't waver. She was no longer swayed by emotional pleas. "Liam, you and Ashley chose this path, not me. You were given a chance to stop. You chose not to." "But Mom, this is a legal battle. It could ruin us," he cried. Deborah took a deep breath. She had carried the weight of this for so long that his sudden panic felt foreign and almost distant. "It's exactly what it is, Liam," she said. "A legal battle, and it's a direct result of what you and your wife have been doing for over a year. I'm just taking back what's mine." She hung up the phone, her hands trembling, but not from fear. It was the trembling of a woman who had finally and irrevocably taken a stand. She had drawn the line. The game was no longer emotional, and the power dynamic had shifted completely. The bottomless pit had finally been confronted, and Deborah was ready to face whatever came next. The meeting room was small and airless, a sterile box designed to remove all emotion from the conversation. On one side of the polished mahogany table sat Liam and Ashley, fidgeting in their chairs, a cheap young lawyer beside them who looked thoroughly unprepared. On the other side sat Deborah and her attorney, Sarah, who looked as calm and unmovable as a mountain. The air was thick with unspoken accusations, but for Deborah, there was only a sense of quiet finality. This was not a conversation. It was a negotiation, the last act of a play that had run far too long. I think we can all agree that we'd like to avoid a lengthy and costly court case. Ashley began, her voice quivering slightly. She looked at Deborah, her eyes welling with what looked to Deborah like crocodile tears. "Deb, please, can't we just talk about this like family?" It was the same old script, the same tired performance, but Deborah no longer felt the old familiar pangs of guilt. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind 100 times, and she knew her lines. She simply shook her head and looked at Sarah. Sarah, a master of her craft, took over. "The time for talking like family has passed, Ashley. We are here to formalize a legal agreement based on the facts." She opened her own briefcase and laid out a series of documents. "The facts are these. Mrs. Hayes purchased this home in her name and with her funds. The subsequent financial transfers were gifts that you consistently demanded, and in some cases, you used emotional blackmail to obtain. We have a ledger of every one of them." Ashley's eyes darted to Liam, a silent plea for him to do something, anything. Liam simply looked down at his hands, his face a mask of defeat. The lawyer next to them cleared his throat nervously. "Mrs. Hayes is willing to transfer the title of the property to your names," Sarah continued, her voice even and clear. "However, she is seeking a legal guarantee that you will make no further demands for her finances, nor will you attempt to interfere with her personal life or relationships, specifically with her grandchild. We have also prepared documents outlining the repayment of all the loans that were previously agreed upon." Ashley erupted. "Loans? What loans? This is crazy. She gave us that money. This is all because she's old and bitter and wants to control us. We are her family." But the old power of her emotional outburst was gone. It had no effect here, in this room of contracts and legal precedents. Sarah simply leaned forward. "The court will decide if these were gifts or loans, Ashley. But they will also look at the documented threats you made. They will consider the public harassment on social media, the refusal of access to Mrs. Hayes's grandchild, and the fact that you have provided no financial support to your own household in over a year. Your own lawyer can tell you the evidence is not on your side." The words landed with the force of a hammer blow. Liam and Ashley's faces, once filled with defiance, now registered pure, unadulterated panic. They looked at their own lawyer, who could only offer a shrug. The game was over. They had nothing to trade, no leverage to use, no emotional strings to pull. They were face to face with the cold, unyielding reality of the law, a force they had no power to manipulate. The discussion continued for another hour, but it was just a formality. The terms were non-negotiable. Liam and Ashley, defeated and outmaneuvered, finally signed the papers, their hands trembling. Deborah watched them, not with triumph, but with a quiet, hollow sadness. She had won the battle, but in a way, she had lost something even more precious. She had won her freedom back, but the cost was a final, irretrievable crack in the foundation of her family. The air outside Sarah Jenkins's office was crisp and cool, a stark contrast to the stagnant tension of the meeting room. Deborah took a deep breath, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, it didn't feel like a struggle. The weight she had been carrying, the fear, the guilt, the resentment, had been lifted. She had won. The house was once again legally hers, and the golden cage had been unlocked. But the victory felt hollow, a heavy, quiet thing. She had gained her freedom, but she had lost her son. She walked to her car, not with a triumphant stride, but with a weary, solemn pace. There were no cheers, no celebrations, only a profound sense of emptiness. She had done what was necessary, what was right, but the cost was a hole in her heart where her relationship with Liam used to be. The family she had sacrificed for no longer existed. It had unraveled in a sterile room with signatures and legal clauses. When she arrived back at her cottage, she looked across the yard at the sprawling main house. It stood there, magnificent and silent, a monument to a dream that had turned into a nightmare. She walked over to it, unlocking the front door with a key that now felt entirely different in her hand. The house was empty. Liam and Ashley had been staying at a friend's since the final legal papers were served. She walked through the silent rooms, her footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. The living room where Ashley had first asked for money for a sectional. The kitchen where the espresso machine had sat. The nursery, a pristine room waiting for a life that now felt distant and unreachable. Each room was a memory, a ghost of a failed hope. The house was beautiful, but it was tainted. It was no longer a symbol of her generosity, but of her pain. It was a beautiful, expensive mistake. She didn't need it. She didn't want it. It was a reminder of everything she had endured. A week later, after a long, tearful call with her friend Patricia, Deborah made a call to a real estate agent. "I'd like to sell the house," she said, her voice firm. The agent, a cheery woman who knew the neighborhood, was surprised. "So soon, but it's a beautiful property, Mrs. Hayes, a great investment." "It's not an investment," Deborah said softly. "It's a lesson, and I've learned all I can from it." The "for sale" sign went up on the front lawn. A stark announcement to the neighbors that the drama was finally coming to an end. It was the physical act of moving on. With the house on the market, Deborah began to fill the empty space in her life with new purpose. She bought a journal and a pen, and she began to write, not just about the past, but about the future. She started going for long walks, exploring the quiet trails she had always been too busy to notice. She pulled out a box from her closet, filled with travel brochures from years ago, places she and her husband had always wanted to see but never had the time. Italy, Greece, the coast of Maine. She spread them out on her small kitchen table, the vibrant photos a stark contrast to the muted tones of her current life. This new beginning wasn't a sudden burst of happiness. It was a quiet, gradual process, like a slow sunrise after a long night. She still felt a pang of sorrow when she saw a little boy playing in a park, or when she thought of the grandchild she may never know. But the sadness was no longer a cage. It was simply a part of her story, a memory of the woman she used to be. She was no longer a mother-in-law, no longer a bank. She was simply Deborah. And for the first time in a very long time, that felt like enough. 1 year can feel like a lifetime, or it can feel like a fleeting moment, depending on what fills it. For Deborah, the year that followed the sale of the house was a lifetime. She left the neighborhood, sold her cottage, and moved into a small, sun-drenched apartment on the other side of town, a place with a little balcony overlooking a park. The windows of her new home looked out onto the world, not onto a battlefield. The sale of the house had brought back a significant portion of her savings. The money, once a source of bitter conflict, was now a tool for building a life she had always dreamed of but never had the courage to live. She didn't buy new, expensive things. She bought experiences. Her first trip was to Italy, a place her late husband had always wanted to see. She walked through the cobblestone streets, ate gelato in the sun, and stood in awe before monuments that had outlasted empires. In the bustling piazzas, surrounded by strangers, she felt a profound sense of peace. She was no longer defined by her relationship to others, but by herself. She was a traveler, an observer, and a person with a story that was finally, truly her own. Upon her return, her life continued to expand. She took painting classes, filling a small studio apartment with canvases of vibrant landscapes. She joined a book club, and she found herself laughing again, a deep, genuine laugh she hadn't heard in years. Her friend Patricia was right. She was fighting for the woman she used to be. And she was finding that woman was still there, a little bruised but stronger and more resilient than ever. The money from the house was more than she could ever spend on herself. She thought about it often, about the lessons she had learned. Sacrifice, she now understood, was a beautiful act, but it required two people, one to give and one to receive with gratitude. When one person takes, it's not a sacrifice, it's a transaction. And in a transaction, there is a winner and a loser. She decided to use her experience for good. She created a small, private fund, a silent project of her own called the Deborah Hayes Foundation for Dignity in Old Age. It was designed to provide pro bono legal assistance to elderly individuals who had been financially exploited by their own families. She worked with Sarah Jenkins, her lawyer, to find and help people who were where she had been a year ago, trapped, afraid, and alone. She never saw Liam or Ashley again. There were no phone calls, no letters, no desperate pleas for reconciliation. The silence was absolute, and over time it ceased to be a source of pain. It was a blank space where a new chapter could be written. She had lost her family, but she had gained her freedom. She had lost a son, but she had found herself. She was no longer a bank, no longer a doormat, no longer a victim. She was a woman who had learned the hard truth that love cannot be bought, and that the only true happiness comes from living a life with purpose and dignity. The golden cage was gone, and for Deborah, the best, the most beautiful part of her life was just beginning. Thank you, our dear audience, for joining us on Deborah's journey. Life is a journey with its ups and downs, but what truly matters is that we learn to get back on our feet after a fall. Always value yourself, love with sincerity, and never stop searching for life's meaning. We wish you and your families abundant health, endless happiness, and peace. See you in our next story.